The windshield wipers couldn't keep up with the torrential rain as Blake Thompson drove home after a 14-hour shift at the auto repair shop. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter when he spotted her, a small figure huddled by the side of Route 47, drenched from head to toe. A little girl, alone, at midnight. Blake's foot hit the brakes before his mind could process the decision. Through the rain-blurred glass, he caught sight of something that made his breath catch. A silver bracelet glinting on her tiny wrist, identical to one he'd given someone 6 years ago. The child looked up as the headlights illuminated her face, those eyes blue as winter sky, filled with some dark sorrow. She didn't run, didn't cry. Instead, she stood and walked toward the truck with the certainty of someone who had been waiting. "Daddy," she whispered through the passenger window, her small hand pressed against the glass. "I've been waiting for you." Blake's world tilted. He had never seen this child before in his life. Blake Thompson had learned to survive on 4 hours of sleep, and the sound of a 4-year-old's laughter echoing through rooms that felt too empty. The alarm clock on his nightstand read 5:30 in the morning, but his eyes had been open for the past 20 minutes, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a butterfly with broken wings. The sound of Leo's breathing from the next room was the only thing that made mornings bearable anymore. 4 years old and already showing signs of his mother's gentle spirit, Leo was the reason Blake dragged himself out of bed every day, the reason he'd traded his surgeon's scrubs for oil-stained coveralls after the accident, that had taken everything except what mattered most. The kitchen held the familiar chaos of single parenthood, amplified by the boundless energy of a preschooler. Cereal boxes stood open like sentries on the counter, sippy cups formed a small army in the sink, and somewhere under a pile of unpaid bills lay Leo's coloring book from the night before. Blake moved through the morning routine with mechanical precision, packing Leo's lunch in the dinosaur lunchbox that had been a birthday gift from his late wife, checking that his son's backpack contained everything from crayons to the stuffed elephant Leo couldn't sleep without. "Daddy, you forgot to cut my sandwich into triangles," Leo called from his booster seat at the kitchen table, his voice carrying that particular tone children master when they realize their parents need constant reminding about the important things in life. Blake smiled, despite the exhaustion pulling at his shoulders. Leo had been keeping track of these small rituals with the dedication of someone who understood that routine was the only thing standing between their small family and complete chaos. The drive to Leo's daycare took them past the playground where Blake's wife used to push Leo on the swings, back when their biggest worry was whether Leo would nap long enough for them to have a quiet dinner together. Now the swings moved empty in the wind, ghosts of a happiness that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Leo pressed his face against the window, watching the world blur past with the intense concentration children reserve for things adults have stopped noticing. "Miss Karen says we're making Father's Day cards next week," Leo announced, his breath fogging the glass. "She wants us to draw pictures of our daddies at work." Blake's hands tightened on the steering wheel, a reflexive response to any conversation that reminded him how different their life had become since the accident. He'd learned to navigate these moments with the careful precision he'd once used to repair damaged hearts, knowing that one wrong word could upset the delicate balance they'd built together. The auto repair shop where Blake worked sat on the outskirts of town like a forgotten prayer, surrounded by other businesses that catered to people who fixed things instead of throwing them away. Rodriguez Auto had been in the same family for 3 generations, and Carlos Rodriguez had taken a chance on Blake when no one else would hire a former cardiac surgeon with shaking hands and a tendency to work 18-hour days to avoid going home to memories that cut like broken glass. Blake's transformation from Dr. Thompson to just Blake had happened gradually, then all at once. The night his wife died in a car accident, Blake had been in surgery, fighting to save a stranger's life while his own world collapsed in a hospital parking lot 3 miles away. The guilt had been immediate and consuming, the knowledge that he'd been repairing someone else's heart while his wife stopped beating alone in a twisted mass of metal and regret. The malpractice lawsuit had come 6 months later, a family claiming that Blake's distraction following his wife's death had cost them their father. The trembling in Blake's hands had started small, barely noticeable during routine procedures, but had grown until he could no longer trust himself with a scalpel. The medical board had been understanding, but firm. Take time off. Get help. Come back when you're ready. Blake had never gone back. The work at Rodriguez Auto was honest and demanding, requiring a different kind of precision than surgery, but precision nonetheless. Blake found peace in the logic of engines, in the way every part had a purpose and every problem had a solution if you knew where to look. Cars didn't judge you for your mistakes or demand explanations for your failures. They simply broke down and waited patiently for someone skilled enough to fix them. Someone who understood that sometimes the most broken things could be made whole again with enough time and patience. As the day wore on, Blake's mind kept drifting to the bills scattered across his kitchen table, like autumn leaves. The rent was due in 3 days, Leo's daycare needed payment, and somewhere in the pile was a notice from the electric company that he'd been avoiding for a week. The mathematics of survival had become Blake's least favorite subject, a constant calculation of what could wait and what couldn't, what was necessary and what was merely hoped for. The last customer of the day brought in a sedan with a rattling engine and a story about her grandson's graduation that she couldn't afford to miss. Blake listened with the patience he'd learned from his father, understanding that sometimes people needed to explain why their car mattered, why this particular repair couldn't wait. He quoted her a price that would barely cover parts, knowing that Carlos would lecture him later about running a business instead of a charity, but unable to watch another person struggle with impossible choices. By the time Blake locked up the shop, the sky had taken on the grey-green color that preceded serious storms. The radio in his truck crackled with severe weather warnings as he drove through downtown Riverside, past the coffee shop where he'd met Sarah Rivers 7 years ago, past the hospital where he'd once been Dr. Thompson instead of just Blake. The town held too many memories, layers of joy and loss that accumulated like sediment in his chest. Sarah, even now, 6 years after she'd disappeared from his life without explanation, her name could stop Blake's thoughts like a record with a scratch. They'd had 3 perfect months together, a brief interlude of happiness between the end of his residency and the beginning of his cardiac surgery fellowship. Sarah had been working at the art gallery downtown, selling paintings to tourists and dreaming of opening her own studio someday. She'd made Blake laugh in ways he'd forgotten were possible, had shown him that life could be about more than work and achievement and the endless pursuit of perfection. Then she'd vanished. No explanation, no goodbye, no forwarding address. Blake had searched for her, had called every gallery in 3 states, had even hired a private investigator who'd found nothing but dead ends and shrugged shoulders. Eventually, Blake had forced himself to move on, to accept that some people came into your life like shooting stars, brilliant and brief and impossible to hold on to. 2 years later, he'd met Rebecca at a medical conference, a pediatric nurse with kind eyes and a laugh that reminded him that healing was possible. They'd married quickly, moved in together, built a life that felt solid and real and permanent. Leo had arrived right on schedule, a perfect baby who'd slept through the night from the beginning and smiled at everything like the world was a constant source of wonder. The accident had happened on a Tuesday evening in March, black ice and bad timing combining to create a tragedy that no amount of medical training could have prevented. Rebecca had been coming home from her book club when her car hit a patch of ice and slid into an oncoming truck. The doctors at the emergency room had been gentle but direct. There was nothing anyone could have done. Some things were simply beyond human power to fix. The storm hit with the suddenness of a car accident, turning the world outside Blake's windshield into an impressionist painting of water and light. Blake drove slowly, knowing that his truck's bald tires and worn brake pads made him a danger to himself and everyone else on the road. The radio announcer's voice competed with the thunder, issuing flash flood warnings and advising people to stay indoors until the storm passed. Route 47 stretched ahead like a river of asphalt, lined with pine trees that bent and swayed in the wind like dancers performing some ancient ritual. Blake had driven this road thousands of times, could navigate it blindfolded, but tonight it felt different, charged with the kind of electricity that made dogs howl and made sensible people lock their doors. The headlights of his truck carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, illuminating only a few feet of road at a time. That's when he saw her, a small figure huddled by the roadside, so still that Blake's first thought was that someone had abandoned a doll or a bag of clothing. But as his headlights swept over the shape, he saw the unmistakable outline of a child, sitting in the tall grass with her knees drawn up to her chest. Blake's foot found the brake pedal as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. No child should be out here, not in this weather, not at this hour, not alone. The little girl looked up as his truck came to a stop, and Blake felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that had no logical explanation. Her hair was dark and plastered to her head by the rain. Her clothes were soaked through, but her eyes held a calm acceptance that was somehow more disturbing than tears would have been. She stood slowly, moving with the careful deliberation of someone much older than her apparent age. Blake rolled down his passenger window, rain immediately soaking the seat beside him. "Sweetheart, what are you doing out here?" His voice carried the gentle authority he'd learned from years of talking to frightened children in hospital rooms. The little girl approached his truck without hesitation, and as she drew closer, Blake saw the silver bracelet on her wrist, a delicate chain with a heart-shaped charm that caught the light from his dashboard. The bracelet looked exactly like one he'd given to Sarah Rivers 7 years ago, during those 3 months when he'd thought he might have found someone to build a future with. Sarah, with her laugh like silver bells and her way of making ordinary moments feel like celebrations. Sarah, who had disappeared from his life as suddenly as she'd entered it, leaving behind only questions and a silver bracelet he'd bought with his first paycheck from the hospital. "Daddy," the little girl said, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I've been waiting for you." The words hit Blake like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and making his vision blur at the edges. He stared at this child he'd never seen before, at her blue eyes that reminded him of winter mornings, at the way she looked at him with a familiarity that shouldn't exist. Blake's hands trembled as he reached across to unlock the passenger door. The little girl climbed into the truck with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, settling into the seat and pulling the door closed behind her. She was small for what Blake guessed was about 6 years old, but there was something in her posture that suggested a maturity beyond her years. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Blake asked, his voice carefully controlled. The little girl buckled her seatbelt with practiced ease, then turned to look at him with those unsettling blue eyes. "Madison?" she said simply. "Madison Rivers." The surname hit Blake like a second shockwave, confirming what his mind had been trying to deny. Rivers. Sarah Rivers, who had vanished from his life without explanation, who had never returned his calls or answered his letters. Blake turned up the heat in the truck, watching as Madison's shivering gradually subsided. She sat quietly, her small hands folded in her lap, occasionally glancing at him with an expression that suggested she was measuring him against some internal standard. The silver bracelet caught the light every time she moved, a constant reminder of questions Blake wasn't sure he was ready to ask. "Madison, where are your parents?" Blake asked, though he suspected the answer would complicate his life in ways he couldn't imagine. Madison tilted her head slightly, considering the question with the seriousness of a philosopher. "Mommy's gone to heaven," she said matter-of-factly. "And you're my daddy, so I guess you're right here." The certainty in her voice was more disturbing than tears would have been. Blake pulled over to the side of the road, needing time to think, to process what was happening. The storm continued to rage around them, turning the world outside the truck into a blur of motion and sound. Madison sat patiently, as if she had all the time in the world, as if this moment had been inevitable. Blake's mind raced through possibilities, explanations, scenarios that might make sense of this impossible situation. The timeline was adding up in ways that made his chest tight with possibility and dread. If Madison was 6 years old, she would have been conceived 7 years ago, right around the time Sarah had disappeared from his life. But Sarah had never mentioned being pregnant. She had never contacted him after she left. "Madison, how old are you?" Blake asked, though he was already calculating dates in his head, counting backwards from this stormy night to that summer 7 years ago, when Sarah had been the brightest thing in his world. "I'm 6. Madison replied. "I had a birthday last month, but Grandma was too sick to make a cake." The timeline fit perfectly, and Blake felt the ground shifting beneath him like quicksand. The drive home passed in surreal silence, broken only by the storm and the occasional direction from Madison, who seemed to know exactly where they were going. She recognized landmarks that Blake hadn't even noticed they were passing, commenting on the old oak tree by Miller's farm and the way the church steeple looked like a pencil pointing at the sky. It was as if she had traveled this route before, memorizing details for this exact moment. Blake's house sat at the end of a gravel driveway, a modest 2-bedroom structure that he'd bought after Rebecca's death, wanting to start fresh somewhere that didn't echo with memories of what he'd lost. The porch light had burned out weeks ago, but Madison didn't seem to need illumination to navigate the front steps. She waited patiently while Blake fumbled for his keys, then followed him inside with the confidence of someone coming home. Leo was asleep on the couch, having fallen asleep waiting for his father to return, a habit that broke Blake's heart every single night. Blake gently lifted his son, carrying him to his bedroom while Madison watched from the doorway. When Blake returned to the living room, he found Madison examining the photographs on the mantelpiece, her small fingers tracing the frames with careful precision. "That's Leo," Blake said, joining her in front of the fireplace. "He's 4. Madison nodded, as if this information confirmed something she already knew. "He looks like his mommy," she observed, then picked up another photograph, this one showing Blake in his surgical scrubs from his hospital days. "And this is you when you saved people." The observation was so accurate, so specific, that Blake felt his knees nearly buckle. Madison couldn't possibly know about his medical career, about the years he'd spent in operating rooms trying to repair damaged hearts. Yet she spoke with the certainty of someone who had access to information that shouldn't exist. Blake made hot chocolate for both of them, using the special mugs that Leo insisted made everything taste better. Madison wrapped her small hands around the ceramic warmth, inhaling the steam with an expression of deep contentment. "Mommy used to make hot chocolate like this," she said quietly. "She said it was your recipe." The comment hit Blake like a physical blow. He had taught Sarah how to make hot chocolate during one of their late-night conversations, sharing the secret his grandmother had taught him about adding a pinch of salt to bring out the chocolate flavor. It was such a small detail, such an insignificant memory, but Madison spoke of it as if it were a family tradition passed down through generations. "Madison, tell me about your mother," Blake said, settling into the chair across from her. Madison's expression grew thoughtful, as if she were sorting through a lifetime of memories to find the right words. "She was beautiful," Madison began. "She had long hair that smelled like flowers, and she sang to me every night before bed. She told me stories about you, about how brave you were and how much you loved helping people." The description matched Sarah perfectly, down to the way she used to braid her hair and the jasmine perfume she wore. But it was the stories about Blake that made his chest tighten with emotion. Sarah had remembered him, had spoken of him to their daughter, had kept his memory alive in ways he'd never imagined. She got sick last year, Madison continued, her voice growing quieter. Really sick. The cancer made her tired all the time, and she couldn't paint anymore. Grandma tried to take care of both of us, but it was hard. Mommy made me promise that if something happened, I would find you. She said you would take care of me, that you were the best man she'd ever known. Blake felt tears burning behind his eyes, a grief for a woman he'd lost twice now. First when she disappeared from his life, and now when he learned of her death. Sarah had been sick, had struggled as a single mother, had died without ever reaching out to him for help. The weight of missed opportunities pressed down on Blake's shoulders like a physical burden. What happened to your grandmother? Blake asked, though he suspected the answer would be another piece of heartbreak in Madison's young life. She died 3 weeks ago, Madison replied, with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children sometimes develop when they've experienced too much loss too early. The social workers were going to put me in foster care, but I ran away. I knew how to find you. The story was beginning to make sense in the most heartbreaking way possible. Madison had been living with her grandmother after Sarah's death, had been thrust into the foster care system after losing the only family she'd known, and had somehow found the courage to run away and find a father she'd only heard about in stories. Blake looked at this small, brave girl who claimed to be his daughter and felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that went deeper than logic or DNA tests. Madison had Sarah's eyes, but Blake's stubborn chin. She held her hot chocolate mug the same way Blake did, with both hands wrapped around the ceramic for maximum warmth. And there was something in her posture, a quiet confidence that Blake recognized from his own childhood photographs. Madison, how did you know where to find me? Blake asked. Madison reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope, yellowed with age and worn soft from handling. Mommy kept this, she said, holding out the envelope. She said it had your address, that you'd written to her but she was too scared to write back. Blake's hands shook as he recognized his own handwriting on the envelope, a letter he'd sent to Sarah 4 years after she'd disappeared, when he'd finally worked up the courage to try to contact her one last time before his wedding to Rebecca. He'd never received a response, had assumed she'd thrown the letter away without reading it. But Sarah had kept it, had treasured it enough to preserve it for years. Inside the envelope was the letter Blake had written, full of apologies and explanations and hopes for closure. But there was something else, something that made Blake's breath catch in his throat. A small ultrasound photograph, black and white and grainy, showing the outline of a tiny human being. On the back, in Sarah's careful handwriting, were the words, Blake's daughter, due March 15th, 20. Blake stared at the photograph until the images blurred together, processing the magnitude of what he was seeing. Sarah had been pregnant when she left him. She had carried his child, had given birth to his daughter, had raised Madison alone while Blake had been oblivious to their existence. The guilt hit him like a tsunami, drowning him in questions about what might have been different if he'd known. She wanted to tell you, Madison said, as if reading his thoughts. But she was scared you wouldn't want us. She said you had important work to do, saving people, and she didn't want to be a burden. And then later, when she found out you got married and had Leo, she thought it was too late. The explanation was so perfectly Sarah, so consistent with her tendency to sacrifice her own needs for others, that Blake felt his heart breaking all over again. Sarah had protected him from a responsibility she thought he didn't want, had watched from a distance as he built a life with someone else, had never known that Blake had spent years wondering what had happened to her. Madison yawned, a sound so small and vulnerable that Blake felt his protective instincts surge like a tide. This little girl had been through more trauma in her 6 years than most adults experienced in a lifetime. She had lost her mother, her grandmother, her home, and had somehow found the courage to search for a father who didn't even know she existed. Blake carried Madison to his bedroom, tucking her into his bed while he settled into the chair by the window. She fell asleep almost immediately, her breathing deep and even, one small hand still clutching the silver bracelet that had been her mother's. Blake watched her sleep, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the way her eyelashes cast shadows in the lamplight, the peaceful expression that made her look even younger than her 6 years. The next morning brought sunshine and the practical realities of Blake's new situation. Madison woke up early, helping herself to cereal and orange juice with the independence of a child who had learned to take care of herself. Leo emerged from his bedroom like a small tornado, stopping short when he saw Madison sitting at their kitchen table. "Daddy, who's that?" Leo asked with the directness that 4-year-olds had perfected. Blake took a deep breath, preparing to explain a situation that he was still trying to understand himself. "Leo, this is Madison. She's going to be staying with us for a while." Leo studied Madison with the intense concentration he usually reserved for complicated puzzles. "Are you my sister?" Leo asked Madison, who looked to Blake for guidance before answering. Blake nodded slightly, giving her permission to speak the truth that was still sinking in for all of them. "Yes," Madison said simply. "I'm your big sister." Leo accepted this information with the easy adaptability of childhood, immediately launching into a detailed explanation of house rules and the proper way to pour cereal without making a mess. Blake called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years, knowing that Carlos would understand even if he couldn't explain the full situation over the phone. There were legal issues to consider, paperwork to file, authorities to contact. Madison was officially missing from the foster care system, and Blake would need to prove his paternity and petition for custody. The bureaucratic maze ahead of them seemed overwhelming, but Blake had navigated worse challenges. The three of them spent the morning exploring the house, with Madison commenting on details that suggested a familiarity that shouldn't exist. She knew that the bathroom door stuck and needed to be lifted slightly to close properly. She knew that the kitchen faucet dripped and that Blake kept a small bowl underneath to catch the water. She knew which floorboards creaked and how to step over them without making noise. "How do you know about these things?" Blake asked as Madison demonstrated the trick to opening the sticky pantry door. Madison looked at him with those unsettling blue eyes, as if the answer should be obvious. "Mommy told me about your house," she said. "She remembered everything about you, even the little things. She said that when you love someone, you remember all the details." The observation hit Blake with unexpected force, revealing the depth of Sarah's feelings in a way that letters and photographs couldn't convey. Sarah had loved him enough to memorize the quirks of his house, to pass those memories on to their daughter like family folklore. She had created a connection between Madison and Blake that transcended physical presence, preparing their daughter for this reunion even while keeping them apart. Over the following days, Blake watched Madison integrate into their lives with remarkable ease. She helped Leo with his coloring books, displaying a patience and gentleness that impressed even Leo's daycare teacher when Blake brought both children for show and tell. She took over small household tasks without being asked, folding laundry and organizing cupboards with the efficiency of someone who had been taking care of herself for far longer than her 6 years. But it was the small moments that convinced Blake beyond any doubt that Madison was his daughter. The way she hummed while doing chores, the same tuneless melody that Blake caught himself humming when he worked on cars. The way she ate her sandwiches by carefully removing the crusts and saving them for last. The way she watched people with the quiet intensity of someone who was always learning, always observing. Leo accepted Madison's presence with the generous heart that Blake had always admired in his son. Within a week, they had developed the kind of sibling rhythm that usually took months to establish. They argued about television channels and shared snacks with equal intensity, treating each other with the casual affection that siblings took for granted. The legal processes moved slowly, grinding through paperwork and interviews and background checks with the efficiency of government bureaucracy. Blake hired a family attorney with money he couldn't afford, taking on extra shifts at the garage to pay for legal fees. But every night when he came home to find Madison and Leo playing together in the living room, Blake knew that no amount of money or effort was too much to keep his family together. The DNA test results arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered in an official envelope that Blake stared at for 10 minutes before finding the courage to open. The numbers and percentages meant nothing to him, but the conclusion was clear and definitive. Madison Rivers was his biological daughter, conceived during those 3 months when Sarah had been the center of his universe. Blake called the attorney immediately, then sat in his truck in the garage parking lot and cried for the first time since Rebecca's funeral. He cried for the time he'd lost with Madison, for the struggles Sarah had faced alone, for the grandmother who had died knowing that Madison would be left without family. But mostly he cried with relief, knowing that Madison belonged with him and Leo, that their little family was finally complete. The custody hearing was scheduled for the following month, giving Blake time to prepare his case and his home for the social worker's visits. Madison handled the interviews with the poise of someone much older, answering questions about her happiness and safety with a maturity that impressed even the court-appointed advocate. "Do you want to live with Blake permanently?" the social worker asked during her final visit. Madison looked at Blake, then at Leo, then back at the woman with the clipboard. "I'm already home," Madison said simply. "This is where I belong." The social worker made notes on her forms, but Blake could see the smile she was trying to hide. The judge's decision came down on a Friday afternoon in late November, just as the first snow of the season was beginning to fall. Blake was granted full custody of Madison, with the court recognizing both his biological relationship and his ability to provide a stable, loving home. The legal fees had drained Blake's savings, but as he signed the final papers, he knew it was the best investment he'd ever made. They celebrated that night with pizza and ice cream, Leo insisting that Madison's official adoption into their family required a proper party. Madison wore the silver bracelet that had belonged to her mother, and Blake found himself thinking about Sarah, wishing she could see how beautiful and strong their daughter had become. "Daddy," Madison said as Blake tucked her into bed that night, "Mommy told me that you would love me as much as you love Leo. She was right, wasn't she?" Blake smoothed her dark hair, so like Sarah's, and felt his heart swell with a love that was both new and somehow familiar. "Yes, sweetheart," Blake whispered. "She was absolutely right." Madison smiled and closed her eyes, finally at peace in the family she had fought so hard to find. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in a blanket of white that made everything look fresh and new and full of possibility. Blake stood in the doorway for a long time, watching his daughter sleep, marveling at the strange turns life could take. 2 years ago, he had lost Rebecca in a car accident that had shattered his world into pieces. 6 months ago, he had been a single father struggling to make ends meet, working extra shifts just to keep his small family afloat. Now he was the father of 2 children, faced with new challenges but also blessed with twice as much love. The future stretched ahead of them like an unwritten story, full of school plays and birthday parties, scraped knees and bedtime stories, arguments and laughter and all the beautiful chaos that came with raising children. Blake had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, he was looking forward to finding out. As he turned off the lights and headed to his own room, Blake caught sight of his reflection in the hallway mirror. He looked older than his 35 years, worn down by loss and responsibility and the constant struggle to provide for his family. But there was something new in his eyes, a contentment that had been missing for far too long. Blake Thompson had saved a little girl on the side of the road during a storm, but in the end, she had been the one to save him. Madison had brought more than just her presence into their home. She had brought the missing piece of Blake's heart, the connection to Sarah that he had thought was lost forever. In finding his daughter, Blake had also found his way back to the man he used to be, the man who believed in second chances and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. The storm that had brought Madison into their lives had passed, leaving behind clear skies and the promise of new beginnings. And in the quiet of his house, surrounded by the family he had never dared to hope for, Blake Thompson finally understood that sometimes the most precious gifts come disguised as the most unexpected challenges, and that love has a way of finding its way home, no matter how long the journey takes.